If you're here for the first time, you're probably looking at the screen and going, what are we talking about? Like, silent but deadly? Does that mean what I think it means? We have an international student that's been in a part of our family, around our family a ton, around our student ministry. And I leaned over to her last week as the ramp up was running, because Sheila was speaking last week and for Mother's Day. And I leaned over to her, and she just learned to speak English from last year. So she doesn't know all of our colloquialisms. And I leaned over, do you have any idea what silent but deadly means? She goes, I think so. I said, it's about farts. And she goes, oh, yeah. And then she definitely knows. We all know, right? I mean, so she gets it now. But so last week, we started a brand new series called Silent but Deadly. And my wife, I'm not kidding, she killed it. It was awesome. Is it? I mean, it was really cool. And honestly, I sat there and, as she's been working this out, I mean, the way that kind of came out for us was that I told her I was going to speak about comparison and on Mother's Day, and we started talking about it, and she's like, you should, how about this? And she read something, and she's like, hey, how about this? And she'd write something out or tell me about it. And I'm like, babe, I'm kind of thinking maybe this is yours to preach and not mine, because this is, you seem to be really excited about this. And she just started. It really just was something God had birthed in her. And you could tell it because, man, there was this one point in the talk when she said that if you hear something in your head that the enemy's saying that you hear in your head and you wouldn't repeat it to your kids or your husband, then, man, you shouldn't believe that comes from Jesus, and you shouldn't listen to it for a minute longer. Man, I'm telling you, all week long, I've been hearing that in my head. I'm going, man, I hear something in my head, I'm going, man, if I wouldn't repeat that to my kids or to my wife, or if I wouldn't look at them and say, you're not strong enough, you're not smart enough, you're not good enough, you're not this, you're not that. Man, if I wouldn't repeat that didn't come from Jesus. And, man, that's powerful truth. And I was like, man, if we had nothing else, we could have closed in prayer when she said that and been done with it. But, man, we started this series because there are things that are silently killing us. Now, listen, you know what's killing me this week? My oldest daughter turned 18. 18. She's 18. She's over here. Everybody tell her happy birthday this week. All right, but but she turned 18. That kills me, Now, she's in what we call dual enrollment. We finishing up high school, and she's also enrolled in college. And so you have this kid who's wandering in and out of a college, campus over at Cornfield State. I mean, Jackson State over here. And she gets over there, and she gets to go in, go out, and all the stuff. And she came home because she had to pick a book to write for this thing. Now, this is a college course, and she's a little nervous about it because she's always written kind of high school level paper. She's got to write a college level paper. She shows the book to the professor, and the professor says, yes, that'll be a great book. But you know what? It's a story about murders that happened in Chicago, kind of ancient historical murders. And so she's wanting to read this huge, thick book. And I'm like, man, I look for the book with the pictures in it when I had to do those papers. Oh, look, this one has a whole section in the middle with pictures, So she's really got this high aspiration, and she goes in and she shows it to him. And he says, you know what you should do? You should format your paper like a crime show. Watch a couple of crime shows and format the paper like a crime show, and that'll make better sense of the way she's doing it. So she comes, tells me about it. I'm like, I got the one for you. So I started her watching Criminal Minds, okay? Which was a great idea in my head, until I realized, she's not only is she binge watching them at an unhealthy level, okay? But, she's also, for the first 3 seasons, terrified. If she's like, I turned it off, it was scared me, And then I'm starting to look around at Walmart and going, that guy could be a serial killer. And the good thing is, at Walmart, he could be a serial killer. I mean, it's a really good chance, right? So, but one of the things I love about particularly about Criminal Minds, but all criminal shows in general, is, first of all, we have these horrible crimes, these big problems. They're solved in an hour. I like that, right? You know that they're going to fix it, and if at worst, it's going to go 2 parts, right? And that's usually if somebody's in trouble or going to die or something like that. But for the most part, in 2 hours, they're going to tie it up in a nice, neat little bow and push it away. I love that, okay? The second thing I love about it is the word unsub. It just sounds so official, okay? The word unsub, the unsub is, and I'm like, for the first little bit, I'm like, what does unsub mean? Then I figured it out. It means unidentified subject, which they could just call him a person at that point, right? The guy who's doing this, the lady who's doing this, the unsub at this whatever. That's how we are, though. We all, every single one of us, have an unidentified subject, an unsub in our life that's sneaking up on us. He's unknown to us. And that's how it is every time in Criminal Minds. Every time on these shows, the person is not somebody that they know is there. They aren't looking for this particular guy until the end of the show. They have no idea. A lot of times, all they see is the damage, the carnage from the crimes that he's committing. All it is they show up in a garage and this person's tied up a certain way and there's a signature. Or they show up on a scene and there's this person who's been hurt and this or disposed of in this certain way, or this certain thing has happened to them over and over and over again, and they're starting to go like this. We're seeing the same thing happen over again. And the cops go, man, there's a serial killer. And so they call the BAU, and the BAU comes, that's the Behavioral Analysis Unit, for those of you who haven't spent as much academic time as I have. But so they come in on the scene and they look at it and they're like, the kind of person who did this is this. That's exactly what we're doing. You and I are looking at the damage that happens in our life, the things that are going on in our life today, and we're going, hey, you know what? I see a pattern. And I want you to know something. I see a pattern all the time. I see this show up, this particular issue, this particular unsub, I see show up in our lives every day. I see it in our volunteers. I see it in your kids. I see it in our families. I see it in our marriages. I see it in our lives every single day. Every week, we have conversations at our staff meeting about how we see this unsub showing up in your life, because you know what? We're all busy people, and we all get caught up in the busyness trap. We're so busy that we get more and more and more stuff piled on, but very rarely do we evaluate it and take stuff off of our list. So here's the thing I want to talk about, is how the enemy attacks us silently and quietly, and he sneaks in with some things that seem like they're really good, right? And they sneak in, they creep them, they take over big chunks of our life. And over time, the goodness of them fades. And all we're left is the endless sucking of our life away. And that happens all the time. Now listen, this isn't a time management sermon, right? I'm not up here to talk to you about how to better manage your time, do some stuff. We're going to look at a particular story in Scripture. And it's the story, maybe you've heard of Martha and Mary. Now we have a tendency to give Martha a hard time. I know that. Because that's like Martha, 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 right? Like we are, like those of you who never watched the Brady Bunch. All right. Verse 38, chapter 10, it says this: as Jesus and the disciples continued on their way to Jerusalem, there came to a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. Her sister Mary sat at the Lord's feet, listening to what he taught. But Martha was distracted by the big dinner that she was preparing. She came to Jesus and said, Lord, doesn't it seem unfair that my sister just sits here while I do all the work? Tell her to come and help me. But the Lord said to her, my dear Martha, you are worried and upset about all these details. There is only one thing that is worth being concerned about. Mary has discovered it, and it will not be taken away from her. Now, we tend to give Martha a little bit of grief. I mean, if you've ever heard a talk on this story before, we're like, Martha, she's this loser, she does this thing, she gets Jesus is there, she's busy doing stuff. Mary gets it, Martha doesn't. And I think Jesus, the wisdom of Jesus, I got to be honest with you, right? The wisdom of Jesus here is unbelievable. You know why? Probably because he probably could have found a husband and wife where this story was the same, right? But man, his wisdom, right? Because if he would have ragged us husbands out, this would have been the sermon for Father's Day every year, right? Like this would have been the one thing every year. We're talking about Martha and Larry again, and Larry's being lazy, and he's sitting in the cat. Like we would have had this whole talk about how we got to engage his father, but he did it right. I mean, in his wisdom, the example that God inspired into Scripture is Mary and Martha, these sisters. And we give Martha all this grief, but I want to get something out of it really quickly as we lay into this story that, man, this is so important. Verse 38, look at what it says. Just glance back at it. As Jesus, as the disciples continued on their way to Jerusalem, they came to a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed them into her home. I mean, get something. They wouldn't have been in the home at all. There wouldn't have been any action or reaction or interaction with Jesus at all had Martha not invited him. I mean, Mary can say what she wants to say. We could say Mary's got her eye on the ball and she knows what's going on and everything's bad and everything's great. And Martha, man, she's so busy and she's so distracted. She doesn't even barely notice that Jesus is there. But understand something. for those of you who associate with Martha, who get it, right? The task-oriented, let's get it done people. Now, you may already get this, right? But I am not Martha, okay? I can be Martha-like sometimes. Like I can get very driven, I can get very ignore everybody and focus on one thing. But generally speaking, I'm pretty laid back. I'm pretty much like I don't know, it'll be all right. We'll just figure it out later. It'll be cool. Just fire the grill up later, or we'll just nuke it. Like we'll be fine, But I'm kind of that way. But for those of you who feel like, man, people get on you in this because you've got to be a little less driven and geared down a little bit, I want you to know something. Man, we wouldn't even have this story if it weren't for Martha. We wouldn't have an interaction or reaction, some sort of connection with Jesus without Martha's willingness to invite Jesus in. But the thing that we get really quickly is what is very good can become very bad very quickly. Understand something, some things that you and I need to understand, every one of us in our lives, is things that we think are very good can become very bad very quickly. We've all had it happen, right? You signed your kid up for baseball, and you're so proud of him, right? He hits the ball so far. It goes right out of the infield every time. I mean, I can't believe the accuracy with which he hits the ball. It sits on that tee, and he just knocks it out of the park. It's amazing. And you start, we're going to play travel t-ball, right? Like, we're on, right? We're going to sign him up. We're playing in Zimbabwe next weekend. We're in, And then it's about 2 years, and your kid sucks at baseball, right? You're going, he can't hit the ball there, and coach pitch now, right? It hits him in the face, and he still swings 3 minutes later, but you're still going every week. You're still on every travel ball team ever. Things that were very good at the beginning can become very bad very quickly, right? We get this, and you're the only one who can't see it because we've not taken time to reevaluate what we're dealing with in our lives. Now, it may not be the case for you in a sport like that, because over time you go, you know what? Doesn't even like this stuff anymore, We got him in this travel ball team, and he complains about it every time. She complains about it every time we get in the car. She complains about it when we're headed to the field. She gets out there, all she does is sulk. After a couple of years of that, you're like, man, I'm done. So only the very, very bad things rise to the top. But what happens when it's our time that just kind of goes on about life, and it doesn't begin to drain us in a really obvious way? It's not a constant battle to get you to do these things. We go through this all the time. I was involved in this thing in the community, and man, at first it was so amazing. But now it's just maintenance and meetings and stuff like that. And eventually you go, man, I get discouraged with it, but I don't do it. I haven't really cut it out of my life. We have to understand something about time, is that when God begins to move in a different way, or when something that is very good can become very bad for us very quickly. And we have to be willing to constantly evaluate or look at the things that are in our life and go, you know what, is this really benefiting? What's the return on my investment? I'm investing in this. Am I getting much out of it? And that's what happens in our life. If we're not intentional about evaluating our actions, then our benefit from it can be kind of diminished really quickly. And then we get discouraged, right? Then we get angry. Then we get frustrated. That's what happens with Martha, right? Martha's in the kitchen. She's off by herself, and she's getting more and more bitter, and she's invited Jesus into the home, and then she kind of lost sight of it, and it just kind of lost its purpose. And the next thing she went from working to angry to frustrated to bitter, and then she kind of just lashed out at Mary, right? We all get to those places where things that were very good become very bad very quickly. We need to continually evaluate the things in our life that need to be evaluated, the things where we spend our time. Tonight we're going to do something cool, and I think that you honestly could really value this time. It's an hour or so, hour and a half of time. We're going to get together, and we call them discussion groups, okay? So this is the time of year where it's kind of like I'm too busy to start a new small group. I don't want to get into one. It's summer almost, and all these things are going on. So I just want to invite you out tonight. We're going to take this topic, not time management, right? We're going to talk about this passage, this idea. We're going to unearth some new stuff. I wrote the discussion questions for this week. I'm more excited about the discussion tonight than I am excited about this talk. And so it's great stuff. Tonight at 6:30 right here, just show up. We're going to break up into groups after I'm going to do a couple illustrations that help us a little bit further understand some things in this thing. And we're going to unearth some totally new ideas. This is not just rehashing where we've already been, but you're going to be trained. You're going to have an idea of what we're talking about because we're going to spend half an hour together. And then tonight, you're going to have an opportunity to live it out and just really kind of drill down. This is a great chance to know some stuff tonight, 6:30, right here. And you get to know some stuff and apply and take your next step out of it. And you get to meet some other new people. Because, man, whether you're new or you've been around for a while, this is always a great kind of thing for you to meet people. I'm really excited about it, 6:30 tonight. But here's the deal. The story goes on. In verse 41, it says this. It says, but the Lord said to her, so she comes in, complains to him, and she says, I'm mad about this, right? What was very good, she's real excited, became very bad very quickly. She gets all bitter and angry. She comes in and tells Jesus, hey, my sister's being lazy. Would you tell her to come in here? And this is great what he says. My dear Martha, right? Martha, 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 you're worried and upset over all these things. You ever get worried and upset? When points of something you get used to like really bring you life, you know, and then all of a sudden it just isn't there anymore and you get frustrated with it? You ever been in a role in your life and you're like, man, I really thought this was going to be great. And then time eventually just kind of takes its toll on what you're doing and you lose sight of the purpose and the meaning. And man, I got to tell you something. You got to know this. This is so important. Jesus doesn't miss the opportunity to address Martha's heart. Because this isn't really about about the work and who gets it done and who does it and certain things and all that stuff. What this is really about is where Martha's heart is. When Martha had her heart in the right place, she sees Jesus and she invites him into her home. But then over time, it slips away, and her heart and her task have become disconnected. If her heart and her task were still connected, she'd see that she was cooking dinner for Jesus, right? She's cooking dinner for God with skin on. If her heart and her task were still connected, it would be okay. But what has happened is they've become dislodged and eventually disassociated. Martha begins to manage her life in a way that is disconnected from her heart. What she's doing, she loses sight of the value. Understand something. How you spend your time reveals something about your heart. How you spend your time it reveals something about what your heart is like. Understand this, what I'm talking about is that like when you serve, for instance, you're in a nursery, you're holding a baby. You know, if your heart's connected to what you're doing, you're understanding pretty quickly, right? That I'm not just babysitting here. Like, I'm not just walking the floor in the nursery doing the mom bounce, you know, exhausted, you know, or doing the baby curls with two of them, you know. Like, I'm doing this thing. I'm caring about kids, not because I'm holding a baby just to babysit for 30 or 45 minutes or an hour or hour and 20, depending on how long I go, right? And you're not just caring for babies. You are caring for children. You are showing them grace and love. And if your heart and your task are connected, you understand pretty quickly that what you're doing is of significant kingdom value. But it comes frustrating all of a sudden when you detach those two, isn't it? When it becomes a task and you're tired and there's like way too many babies and way not enough people and you're still struggling. Or when you're teaching a toddler or a preschool or an elementary class or a group and they're all over the place and they're bouncing, they're pulling their hair out and this one kid won't stop picking his nose with his thumb and you're like, listen, you're going to stretch your nose out and it's gross. Would you please quit? And you're just at the point where you want to choke him, but you're like, that's not my kid. And you're starting to wonder, like when your task and the whole thing can become disconnected from your heart, you're starting to wonder, can I hit him with something that won't leave a mark? Then you recognize there's a problem here, right? Because we've disconnected it. If our heart were connected, you'd understand that loving on those kids back there is unbelievable, and it raises them in an environment that you and I maybe didn't grow up with, where church is the most amazing, fun hour of their life. I mean, that's really what we love to see every week. We love to see students and kids walking out of this building going, Mom, I don't know where you people are going to church next week, but I'm coming back to Journey because that's a blast. When our heart and our task are connected, we understand that what we're doing builds the kingdom in an unbelievable way. The same thing happens when you greet people or you make coffee or you play in the band. When your heart and your task are connected, unbelievable things can happen. And you begin to do it, but over time, the enemy loves to dislodge and separate those things. We've got to understand something, that how we spend our time, not just where we spend our time and what we're doing, but how we spend it, our heart tells us some things. If you've got an unbelievably valuable task, but it's no longer rewarding, if you're working in the nursery, you're working in the toddlers, you're greeting people at the door, you're making you get like, there's that point where you're like, man, it's hot out here. I don't feel like being in the parking lot. But you lose sight of the unbelievable eternal value it is when we show people God's love. Man, that tells us something about our heart, doesn't it? It tells us something that somehow, somewhere along the way, something that was very good became very bad very quickly because we dislodged it. And we were able to separate it somehow. He addresses that in Martha. He addresses it in you and I. We've got to understand that it begins to tell us something about who we are. Our time has a significant value. Story goes from very good, Martha inviting him in, being a part of it, Martha preparing a meal for him, ministering to Jesus' needs and valuing him, the dislodged, disassociated piece of his task of time kind of become disassembled, and she lashes out at Mary and says, she's being lazy. Jesus says, hey, Martha, you're so worried. You're so worried. Just relax. Just relax. You kind of lost sight of some stuff here. And then the story goes on in verse 42, the last verse in the whole thing. He says, there's only one thing worth worrying about, worth being concerned about, Martha. There's only really one thing. At the very beginning, you got the one thing. You were worried about having time with me. You invited me into the house, right? At the beginning, you understood. You ran right into the kitchen and started preparing this big meal, and you were excited about it. But eventually, the dislodged and disassociated task from your heart took over. And there's only one thing that you lose sight of that's worth being concerned about, and that's being with him. Mary has discovered it. Mary hasn't lost sight of it yet. She will at some point. But Mary hasn't lost sight of it at this point. Mary has discovered it, and it won't be taken away from her. Understand something. What he says to her is that it won't be taken away from her. It doesn't mean that the enemy won't try to dislodge and disassociate for her either, right? Martha got it in the beginning. Martha understood. She invited him in. She started preparing the meal. There became that place where she got more focused on what was going on rather than the eternal value or the significance of the task. And as that kind of became further and further apart, she lashes out. And Jesus says, there's only one thing worth being concerned about, Martha. You used to get it, but you let it get away. Here's what happened with her. You used to get it. I'm not going to take it away from her. She may slip away. But understand something. There's always acceptance to come back in. There's always this way that we can reassociate ourselves. I'm going to introduce you to something called marking your time. It's called, but here's the bottom line, the thing that you need to understand. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. Don't forget that. I love saying that, and it's so true about so many things, right? But the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And that's what that's what Jesus wants Martha to get, right? Is that, listen, you've lost sight of it. You've disconnected it. There's some time, there's some space here, and bitterness is coming in the middle, and you're angry and you're upset. But understand something. There's always redemption. There's always a way to make this right. Mary's found the right thing, the one thing that's worth being concerned about. I'm not taking it away from her. You can have it back if you'd like. And here's this important thing that we have to understand. There is significant value in how we spend our time and where our focus goes and where our heart's at in our focus. I want to introduce you to a concept, and we're going to talk more about it tonight, but it's called marking your time. In quick kind of introduction, there's a rhythm to the way life should work. If you look back at the calendar of Christianity, and some of us have slipped into this is the only time, but there are two primary seasons in the Christian calendar in our world, right? Christmas and Easter. Now, those are just Sundays for us, right? Sometimes we'll go, that's just a Sunday Christmas and a Sunday for Easter. And some people, they're CEO Christians, right? Christian Christmas and Easter only. And so you've got this like gap where there's just like these huge pieces between the two. And when it kind of loses its value, that's what happens. They wind up just being two isolated events. But in the Christian calendar, if you kind of look back even at the history of it, there are lead-up pieces to both of those holidays. Now, most of us who grew up in kind of Protestant homes, maybe you don't even realize it. Some of you are like, oh, yeah, there's a Palm Sunday right before Easter. I forgot about that. You get the palms and all that stuff. There's a whole lot more than just that leading up to Easter. Leading up to Easter, we have a season, the 40 days before Easter, called Lent. And Lent is this time where we sacrifice or fast from one specific thing, kind of leading up into Easter. You see what it does for us is it helps us establish a rhythm for Easter. The same thing kind of looks into the series or the time before Christmas. We call that Advent. So the days before leading up into Christmas, we kind of point our hearts toward Jesus as being born, the Savior born who comes to this world. We see later on how we point our hearts toward Lent, putting that kind of season into it. It helps us establish a yearly rhythm in our life. But then we have to realize that there's more than that, right? If we're going to come back into this whole idea, then we've got to establish some weekly rhythm. Weekly rhythms like this, getting together on Sundays, being a part of a small group, being a part of some things in your life where you establish not just an occasion where we get together when it's convenient, but we establish a weekly rhythm to our life. If you want a relational growth in your time with Jesus, if you want to really grow out of that relationship, then prioritize, not just going to church occasionally around certain holidays, but prioritize this gathering. It really matters in your own value. Now listen, there are going to be some times where you're like, dude, that was lame. Right? You show up and you're like, hey, those were good songs, but man, that Jeremy, it just didn't make a ton of sense. Trust me, there are times because sometimes I go home and I tell Sheila, I'm like, I'm not even sure what that sermon was about. But there's still a value to us getting together, us being together as a family, encouraging each other, pushing each other, spurring each other on to good things. That's what Scripture says. So there's a value to establishing that rhythm yearly, that rhythm weekly, that rhythm daily. Talking about what does it mean to have a quiet, real time alone with Jesus. Man, that's tough. There's not a single person in this room, and I mean that, myself included, myself the king of this, right? There's not a single person in this room who is like flawless in spending daily time with Jesus. Man, it's hard to spend time committed to Jesus. Because it's hard because we have an enemy, and it's hard to establish that rhythm where we're every day getting up and doing the exact same thing. We struggle with it because it's difficult. We struggle with it because it's valuable. And it gets discouraging, doesn't it? Because our task and our heart get disconnected and disjointed, and then they kind of move apart, and we start valuing it. Spending time with Jesus, not just in a yearly, not just in a weekly, not just in a daily time, is valuable to us. Then there's this last thing. We're going to talk more about this stuff tonight. But man, so valuable is the idea of connecting with Jesus on an hourly basis. And you're like, are you serious? Every hour? You're going to stop and spend time, pull the car over and get on the side of the road and pray for 10 minutes every hour? This is kind of crazy how you're going to do that. I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is just deciding a phrase for you. Lord Jesus, thank you. Maybe it's just Rock of Ages, cleft for me. Let me hide myself in you. Maybe it's the words of a hymn, the words of a song. Fear is a liar and he's running out of breath. Maybe it's just that time. Every time that something happens, you have a breath prayer that you just cry out quietly to yourself, Jesus, thank you. Man, I just needed you. Thank you so much. Just something that you just kind of 3, 4, 10 words that you just breathe out quietly to yourself that allows you to establish a rhythm so that your heart and your task don't become disjointed and then disassociated, so that something that's very good doesn't become very bad very quickly. In a minute, Bryce is going to come up and he's going to share a handful of things with you before we take the offering. But man, I just want to invite you out to this one thing tonight. Because tonight's going to be a blast. 6:30, we'll be done before 8 o'clock. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes, do a couple of illustrations that help us understand some stuff, and then we'll get some discussion questions that help you unpack it. You get to meet other people. You get to do some great things. Be a part of it tonight at 6:30. We'll see you then. Here's Bryce.